For nearly 200 years, the Fugate family line, known to the outside world as the Blue People of Kentucky, remained largely sealed off from the rest of society as they passed their blue skin down from generation to generation. The unusual family trait only came to light when Benjamin, or Benji Stacy, was born in 1975, confounding the nurses and doctors present with his unique appearance. Rather than emerging a bright shade of crimson like most newborns, Benji was born with dark blue skin. Doctors were extremely concerned by this alien skin colour, which often indicates a condition called cyanosis or shortage of oxygen in the blood. Accordingly, the hospital called an ambulance to transport Benji the 116 miles from his hometown outside Hazard, Kentucky, to the University of Kentucky Medical Center. After 2 days of tests on the baby, the doctors still had no idea why little Benji's skin was blue. As a transfusion was being prepared for the small boy, Benji's grandmother volunteered some information, asking the medicos if they had ever heard of the blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. It was then that Benji's father, Alva Stacy, spoke up and explained to the doctors that his grandmother on his dad's side was a blue Fugate. Named Luna, she seemed to have had quite an intense manifestation of the characteristic, with other relatives describing the boy's great-grandmother as blue all over and the bluest woman you ever saw. Benji Stacy had been the latest child born in a long line of Fugates, referred to locally as the Blue People of Kentucky, who had lived in the Appalachian Mountains there over the last 197 years. The ancestral line of the Appalachian Fugates had begun 6 generations earlier. A French orphan called Martin Fugate migrated to the United States and settled in Troublesome Creek in the hills of eastern Kentucky in 1820. His family folklore narrative had it on record that he was blue. Fugate married a woman called Elizabeth Smith, who was described as lily white in complexion. Unbeknown to either of them, and by some incredible odds, both carried a recessive gene that resulted in 4 of their 7 children being born with blue skin. The location where the family grew up was remote and isolated. At that time, in rural eastern Kentucky, there were no roads and not even a railroad extended to that part of the state until the early 1910s. Because of the lack of social opportunities, many of the Fugates only met, married, and had children with individuals within their own bloodline. Dennis Stacy, an amateur genealogist and descendant of the Fugates, has explained that as it was hard to get out, his forebears intermarried, quipping, "I'm kin to myself." Benji is descended from a line of this family that started when Martin Fugate's son, Zachariah, married his mother's sister. The genetic isolation of the community enabled the continued reproduction and expression of the Fugate family's blue skin gene. Over the next century or so, the Fugates continued to live their lives in relative isolation and happily were accepted by the people of Troublesome Creek. According to one local resident, they looked like everyone else except for their blue colour. Coal mining and railways were developed in Kentucky from around 1912 and roads laid down about 40 years later. Gradually, the Fugates moved outside of Troublesome Creek so that the Blue People became less common. However, by the early 1960s, some individuals amongst the Blue Fugates had begun to feel self-conscious about their cobalt-tinted skin. Not only did their skin mark them out as different, but by that time other people had already started to associate their skin colour with the family's history of inbreeding. It was then that 2 Fugate family members, a brother and sister, contacted Madison Coween, a hematologist at the University of Kentucky's Lexington Medical Clinic at the time, for help with a cure. Coween remembered them as being greatly embarrassed about their blue appearance and reluctant to even come into the waiting room. He was very aware of how much it bothered them to be blue. Queen had made a study of recessive diseases that only surface if both parents carry a defective gene. The Fugate story posed a medical mystery not seen much today because family gene pools tend to be more diverse. Queen used research obtained from studies of isolated native Alaskan populations. He was able to conclude that the Fugates carried a rare hereditary blood disorder which involves an enzyme deficiency causing excessive levels of methemoglobin in their blood. Methemoglobin is an already oxidized and therefore non-functional blue version of the healthy red hemoglobin protein that delivers oxygen to the body's tissues. In most Caucasians, the red hemoglobin of their circulating blood is revealed through their skin, giving it a pink tint. For the Fugate family, the overabundance of blue methemoglobin in their blood turned their skin colour blue. As the blood disorder arises from a recessive gene, it requires that both parents of a child carry the recessive gene for the disorder to manifest in their offspring. When both parents carry the trait, their children have a 25% chance of inheriting the disorder. Without the Fugates' geographical isolation and intermarriage, this disorder would otherwise have been extremely rare in their bloodline. Happily, Queen devised a surprisingly straightforward cure for this disorder, which counterintuitively involved adding more blue. Apparently, the best chemical for activating the body's process of converting methemoglobin to hemoglobin is methylene blue dye. The members of the Fugate family he treated ingested this dye, and within only a few minutes, the blue coloration of their skin faded and their skin turned pink. As long as they continued to take a daily pill of the antidote, these blue people of Kentucky could pursue a normal life. Regarding Benji, within just a couple of months of his birth, his skin colour began to transform into the usual colour for a baby. By the time he reached age 7, he had lost nearly all of his blue coloration, which indicated that he had probably received a copy of the gene from only one parent. Benji had probably inherited this gene from his father's grandmother, Luna. A local resident who had known Luna was nurse Carrie Lee Kilburn. She described the matriarchal ancestor as bluish all over, remarking that her lips were as dark as a bruise and her skin as blue as she had ever seen. At an American Heart Association clinic in the town of Hazard, Queen found another nurse, Ruth Pendergrass, who also remembered another dark blue woman who had attended the country health department. She described her face and fingernails as almost indigo blue and very concerning at the time, as she appeared to be having a heart attack. But the woman wasn't alarmed and simply identified herself as a sister to one of the Fugate women. Although today Benji and most of the Fugate family descendants have eliminated their blue colouring, the tint still appears in the skin when they are cold or flushed with emotion. Their condition is now one of those rare diseases that students learn about in medical school and infrequent enough to be in every haematology exam. It can also be caused by certain drugs, chemicals and additives, and when levels of methemoglobin in the blood rise to greater than 20%, the effects can become lethal. At levels of between 10 and 20%, people like the Fugate family members can develop blue skin without any other symptoms. Fortunately, most of the blue Fugates never suffered any related health problems and lived into their 80s and 90s. The legacy of the blue Fugates of Kentucky lives on as a family who showed resilience in the face of isolation and potential stigma and a good-hearted perseverance. Marchioness Gladys Townsend was a pioneering British screenwriter early last century. She also reported her own true family ghost story to paranormal researchers of the time. She reports the following account as a true story and disregarded warning. She was unable to name the house where the incidents occurred, as it was at the time regularly up to let as a furnished property. Equally, she did not identify the location of a place she calls the Dangerous Hill, although describing it as set in unspoilt countryside passed through on the way to the south coast of England. The sumptuous house, while being the last word in aristocratic heritage, had been internally fitted with every modern comfort and was a property investor's dream. Managed by a West End real estate agent, all its furnishings were in excellent taste, and thus it came to the attention of Townsend's niece, Tanit. Tanit, a slightly rebellious youth whom she described as having film star looks, had recently become engaged to a pleasant young man called William, whom Townsend had also known since he was a baby. Townsend felt very glad when Tanit announced her forthcoming marriage, but also not so surprised when she added that the happy couple were planning something unusual. There was to be no honeymoon, but they would be renting a furnished house where they would spend a few months. If they found that they didn't get on, they would end the relationship and sublet the house. Tanit explained that marriage was no longer set in concrete as it had been in Townsend's day, that it was safety first, and if the couple is not happy, they can both try again with someone else. Tanit's mother had heard of this lovely furnished house 50 miles from London, from where they could still come back for dances and cinemas while enjoying the romance and escape of living in the country. She and William would be inspecting the house with her mother, who could check that it met all their practical needs the following Monday. Who was to know that this day trip would provoke some kind of sinister curse and end in unexplained tragedy? Townsend later heard that the day began optimistically as William's latest speed car took the very steep incline marked Dangerous Hill with the ease of a swallow's flight. The gleaming mansion was situated at the top of the hill and surrounded by blossoming orchards and daffodil fields. The caretaker met the trio with keys and maps, and while Tanit's mother checked the kitchen and living spaces, the betrothed couple excitedly explored the upstairs and downstairs. They then ventured out to the extensive gardens where there were fountains and a bathing pool. Strolling along stone paths lined with rock terraces with miniature waterfalls, they found a large rock seat overlooking a marvellous view across the green valley. Here they sat to plan their magical spring and summer on the summit of so-called Dangerous Hill. Tanit later reported to her aunt that the pair had been sitting there for about a quarter of an hour when she came. They had not heard her coming, which was strange, as it was so still that a pin could be heard to drop on the flagstone path. Although later realising that she was a ghost, all they saw at the time was a tall, attractive woman, obviously in deep mourning and very sad, who spoke in a kind of faraway voice. She asked Tanit and William, "What brings you here?" William responded that they were thinking of renting the house, explaining, "It's just what we want." Her chilling reply was, "The others thought so too." William went on to explain that he and Tanit were going to be married and were sick of the beaten track, having been everywhere and done everything, cruising, motoring and winter sports. The woman nodded and said that she understood, then asked if they were very much in love. The young couple felt awkward and simply explained that they got on terribly well and hoped they would be happy. At this, the woman gave a very curious response, saying that the others had loved each other very dearly. She said they were about your age, but the hill did not allow them to be happy. Tanit and William began to think that the woman was very odd and asked her what hill and what did she mean. The woman said that she had bought the house, even though she had been told the site and the hill belonged to ancient forces which resent intruders. But she had found the place so beautiful she had not listened. She emphasised, "You must listen, don't come here, go back to London, forget this place, and remember the other two." They questioned her, who were the other two? Did she live here? As she replied that she lived nearby, they suddenly heard a funerary bell tolling somewhere. Tanit shivered as William whispered, "What a depressing sound, we must be close to a church." "Can't you hear the passing bell?" asked the woman. "Be warned." William was starting to become really angry, but the woman smiled a strange, twisted kind of smile and then was gone. She disappeared as quickly as she came, and Tanit realised that although the garden was flooded with bright sunlight, the woman had been shadowless. Tanit had been wondering what seemed so odd about her, and now she knew. The air suddenly felt cold as William, still peeved, queried the strange event and wondered what she meant by forces. What forces? The bell continued to toll as they hurried back into the house. Tanet's mother had nearly finished her check as William took the opportunity to ask the caretaker who was the woman they had met in the garden. He claimed not to know, perhaps someone from the village, he supposed. William was still nervous and wanting to get back to the main road. Tanet's mother said she would join them later as they went to the car. As they got in, Tanet was sure she heard someone laugh, then was surprised to see that from the top the hill looked very steep, with a nasty curve she hadn't noticed before. There was also a board staring them in the face, which was marked Dangerous Hill. William was very angry by now and stood up in the car. "Damn you, Dangerous Hill," he shouted. "I don't care for you or any old forces. We shall live here for as long as we like, and you can't stop us." With that, they streaked down the hill, while Tanet could now hear voices in the air and the distant bell tolling again. At the base of the hill, a lorry lurched out of a concealed turning, and they crashed with a sickening grinding noise. The car was overturned, and the next thing Tanet remembered was the hospital. William had been killed instantly, and her mother later told her that he was dreadfully disfigured. With what she had learned since the crash, Tanet had become convinced that her beloved fiancé was a sacrifice to the things that own Dangerous Hill. The grieving young woman had not said this to anyone but Townsend, her aunt, whose spiritualist beliefs she knew well. They both researched the history of the house and found that the others referred to by the spectral woman were a young engaged couple like William and Tanet. The young man was an only son, and after the car crash on Dangerous Hill, when they both perished, his mother had died of a broken heart. They must have been contacted by her distraught spirit, trying to warn them that the hill demanded a sacrifice. Tanet's mother later heard that the young couple are buried close to Dangerous Hill, which may have accounted for the mournful passing bell they heard. However, who or what are the unknown forces demanding a sacrifice on Dangerous Hill remains a mystery.
Apparently, in the United States, over 600,000 people go missing every year. That is an awful lot of people. Whilst many of these people are found alive, unfortunately others are not, and some just go missing and are never seen again. But what about families? How on earth do families go missing? The following are two families who disappeared in unusual circumstances. Martin family, Oregon. On December the 7th, 1958, Kenneth and Barbara Martin left the home with their three daughters, Barbie 14, Virginia 13 and Susan 11, in their 1954 cream and red Ford station wagon. At the time, the eldest son, Donald 28, was in the Navy and was stationed in New York. The family were intending to drive to the Columbia River Gorge to pick some greenery to use for Christmas decorations. It is uncertain whether they actually reached the gorge, but sometime between leaving their house and driving to the gorge, they disappeared. The first anyone had suspicions of their disappearance was on December the 9th, when Kenneth failed to turn up for work at Eccles Electric Home Service Company. His wife Barbie failed to attend her morning classes at Grant High School, and Susan and Virginia did not turn up for class at Rose City School. That evening, Ken and his boss, Taylor Eccles, became concerned and went to the police. Police then visited their property at 11 p.m. in the hope of finding any clues to where they could have gone. On entering the house, they found nothing out of the ordinary and nothing had been disturbed. The police now had the task of retracing the family's movements. A gas station proprietor called Dean Baxter reported seeing the family after they purchased gas from a station in Cascade Locks at around 4 p.m, which must have been their first stop after leaving Portland. He said their car then headed east after they left the store. The family was then spotted at a snack bar in Hood River where a waitress named Clara York stated she served the family. They were also sighted around dusk near Columbia River in Washington State, where witnesses were able to describe the clothing they were wearing. The first possible lead was when a stolen car was located in Cascade Locks, which was approximately a 2-hour drive south from Columbia Gorge. They initially thought it could have been the Martins' car, but was immediately dismissed as it was the wrong model and colour. However, they did find a handgun close to the vehicle that had been thrown in the bushes and was covered in blood. After checking the serial number, they traced it to a Amir and Frank department store. To add confusion to the case, the gun had subsequently been found to be among several sporting good items that their son Donald had been accused of stealing whilst working at Mira and Frank 2 years earlier. The abandoned car was traced to two ex-cons, who were duly arrested in Hood River County 18 miles away and were charged with car theft. In a further twist of the case, Hood River was one of the last places that the Martin family had been seen. A waiter told law enforcement that the two convicts were in the restaurant at the same time as the Martins, and the two men left at the same time as the Martins. Searches were undertaken by both county police, but neither were able to produce substantial leads. By December the 8th, police had received numerous letters and phone calls, where one of them proved fruitful when an orchard owner east of Portland claimed that around December the 7th he witnessed the man and woman gathering plants. He then added that the following week he observed a flock of buzzards flying around in the same location, but after a thorough police search they found nothing. Then, on December the 28th, they located a woman's glove close to where the stolen Chevrolet had been found. The police were unable to prove it belonged to Barbara Martin. Over the following days, other sightings reported seeing their car speeding on Baldock Freeway, while others claimed they saw them in Burlington, Iowa. On January the 7th, 1959, a truck driver has seen a car with Oregon's license plates matching their car's description in Billings, Montana. By February 1959, investigators searched various locations from the Portland region to Mount Hood. More clues were found when a volunteer searcher found tyre tracks matching their car, which appeared to have driven off of a cliff near the Dalles in Oregon. Paint chips were recovered at the location and sent to the FBI for analysis, and they came back positive. Judging by the tyre marks and paint, investigators believed their vehicle had somehow plunged into the river. Army Corps of Engineers were then called in, where they lowered the level of the river by 5 feet and searched the area using sonar technology, but with no luck. On the 1st of May 1959, a river drilling rig near the Dalles claimed to have hooked something extremely heavy, but it broke away before it could be pulled to the surface, and there is no explanation as to why they did not further pursue this or whether they failed to locate it. Unfortunately, on May the 2nd, the first piece of gruesome evidence was found when a fisherman and his wife reported seeing two bodies floating downstream near Cascade Locks. The bodies were again seen near Bonneville Dam. On May the 3rd, the body of Susan was picked up in Columbia River, near Camas, Washington, 70 miles west of the Dalles. Then on May the 4th, Virginia's body was found near Bonneville Dam, 46 miles west of the Dalles. The coroners claim they both drowned. It appears that the drilling rig could have dislodged the car, possibly releasing the bodies from the vehicle where they floated upstream. Further sonar was used to scour the lake, but to no avail. Police figured that the family had perished when the car drove into the lake. The Multnomah County Police suspected foul play, as there was evidence proving that they were possibly forced into the lake. Police were unable to determine whether the two ex-cons were involved in their disappearance, but Walter Graveman, a Portland detective, felt certain that the family had met with foul play and the case could only be solved when they located the missing car. To this day, the remains of Kenneth, Barbara and Barbie remain undiscovered, and the vehicle has never been found. And maybe one day, if the river runs dry and exposes a vehicle, or a storm surge hits the river, dislodging the vehicle, we may never know the truth. The family's disappearance was one of the most baffling mysteries in Oregon history, and sparked the largest manhunt at the time. Solomon family, California. In 1982, 35-year-old Sol Solomon, a former Israeli commando, lived in Northridge, California with his 39-year-old wife Elaine, their 9-year-old son Mitchell, and Elaine's 15-year-old daughter Michelle from a previous marriage. Sol owned a business that repaired and refilled fire extinguishers. At around 6 p.m. on October the 12th, 1982, Sol left the house with business associate Harvey Rader to attend a car auction. That same day, Elaine's parents visited the home and left at around 10:30 p.m. About 11:30 p.m, Elaine was having a phone conversation with a friend when the doorbell rang. Elaine then told her friend that she had to end the call because Harvey was at the door. That phone call was the last time that anyone had heard from the family. The police were later notified when friends were concerned that they had not heard from the family. When police arrived at the house, they found the Mercedes was not there, and their two other vehicles, a Rolls-Royce and the business car, were still parked outside. On entering the house, the police immediately became suspicious when they discovered splatters of blood on the mattress and wall. The bed was broken and all the bedclothes were missing, and a section of carpet had been torn away. Further suggestions of foul play emerged when on October the 17th, the family's passports, wallets and photos were discovered on the side of the road on the Antelope Valley Freeway outside the town of Acton. Police immediately placed Harvey Rader at the top of their list as a possible suspect, as he was the person that Sol was planning to meet, and Sol's wife had mentioned his name on the phone to a friend. Police also discovered that Rader was a British citizen who had an extensive criminal history. Harvey Rader owned a car dealership, and Sol had invested $20,000 in that business. To add further fuel to the fire, the Solomons' Mercedes was found at Rader's garage. When the police interviewed Rader, he confirmed that they had driven to a car auction at Sol's work car on the evening of October the 12th, and after the auction, Sol wished to be dropped off at an Israeli restaurant. After dropping Sol off, Rader claimed that at 10:30 p.m. he had driven Sol's work car back to the house, then had rung the doorbell and returned the keys to his wife, who in turn handed him the keys of the Mercedes, which had needed some repairs, which he then took to his garage. Rader vehemently denied that he was involved in their disappearance and suggested another reason was that he was involved with the Israeli mafia. He also claimed that Sol's lifestyle far exceeded what he earned in his fire extinguisher business. However, Rader was still the number one suspect, as there were inconsistencies in his story. Firstly, the car auction had actually ended at 5 p.m, whereas Sol did not leave the house until 6 p.m. Secondly, the Israeli restaurant was not open that night. Events took another turn when in November 1983, Rader's cousin, Ashley Paul, claimed that he had seen Rader take Sol's life after Sol had demanded his $20,000 back. Paul had apparently worked for Rader, but then returned to England after the family had gone missing. The only reason Paul had come forward was because Elaine's family had contacted a private investigator who was able to track him down and force him to talk to the police in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Paul then returned to the States, where he gave investigators his official version of the attack on Sol. Paul then added to his story, claiming that another car dealer called Gerald Baxter and two Italian men were heavily involved in the family's disappearance. Paul then claimed that he'd helped Rader bury the family in the desert in Antelope Valley. Paul then implicated Rader in the disappearance of a British couple named Peter and Joan Davis, who went missing on March the 17th, 1982. At the time of the disappearance, the Davis family lived only 2 miles from the Solomons and also had business dealings with Rader. Paul claimed that Rader had taken their lives in order to steal valuable artwork from their home, and he also helped bury that family in the desert near Bakersfield. Rader also told Paul that he was also responsible for the disappearance of yet another Burbank businessman called Ronald Adib, who also had financial dealings with Rader. Yet, when Paul led the authorities to the location of the missing families, they found nothing. Police then arrested Rader and Baxter for the disappearance of the Solomon family, but were later released due to lack of evidence. Police found Paul to be totally unreliable when he admitted to them that Baxter was not involved and the Italians had never existed. Paul had in turn incriminated himself and was charged with the disappearance of the Solomon and Davis family. However, to add more confusion to the story, a judge was forced to dismiss any charges against Paul, where he then returned to England. However, Rader did go on to serve time in prison, but for passport fraud, and after leaving prison in September 1988, he was about to be deported when the authorities arrested him for the disappearance of the Solomon family. This time, Paul refused to return to the States to testify, and without any physical evidence, his case was purely circumstantial. During Rader's trial, his defense team claimed that Sol lost his life due to his activities with the Israeli mafia. Finally, the jury voted 11-1 in favour of convicting Rader, but could not reach a unanimous verdict, and they declared a mistrial. Another hearing was held in May 1992, but again ended when the juror was convinced that the Solomon family was still alive after hearing that 3 witnesses came forward claiming that they'd seen Sol Solomon in the town of Carpinteria in California after October the 12th, the night he supposedly disappeared. The jury then acquitted Rader. The remains of the Solomons and Davis families have never been found.
In December 2002, Sophia Soto from New Jersey documented a series of supernatural events that had haunted her family. Sophia's family, particularly through her grandmother's bloodline, appeared to possess a heightened sensitivity to paranormal phenomena, a trait that Sophia described as being sensitive. This sensitivity wasn't isolated. It had manifested not only in her grandmother, but also extended to Sophia's mother, brother, and all the grandchildren. The first incident had taken place decades earlier in the 1950s in rural Puerto Rico, on the Caribbean island where Sophia's grandmother was born and raised. Her grandmother had lived with her family in an old countryside house that carried its own dark history. Local residents claimed it had been built on the site of a former plantation, a detail some believed was tied to the unnerving encounters that would follow. The house stood near a forested area, isolated enough to make the events that occurred there all the more unsettling. One afternoon, while Sophia's grandmother and her 5-year-old sister, Sophia's great-aunt, were playing innocently in their bedroom, something terrifying occurred. Without warning, the young girl looked up toward an opening in the ceiling, a trapdoor leading to the attic, and began screaming hysterically. Through her cries, she claimed she saw a hand emerging from the opening, reaching down into their play space. The children's mother, Sophia's great-grandmother, and uncle, Sophia's great-uncle, took immediate action, climbing up to investigate the attic. Despite a thorough search, they found no evidence of an intruder or anything else that could explain what the child had seen. Dismissing it as a product of childish imagination, Sophia's great-grandmother assured the girls there was nothing to fear and encouraged them to return to their play. Somewhat reluctantly, the sisters returned to the bedroom. However, upon re-entering the room, Sophia's grandmother experienced an overwhelming sense of discomfort, a feeling that something wasn't right. When she glanced upward toward the same trapdoor, she witnessed the identical frightening sight her sister had described, a disembodied hand reaching down from the attic opening. Confirming each other's experience, both children fled the room in terror, screaming for their parents. At that precise moment, something inexplicable drew the great-uncle's attention to the window. Looking outside, he spotted a male figure walking away from the house toward the nearby forest. Suspecting an intruder might have been responsible for frightening the girls, he decided to pursue the stranger. As he followed, he made a chilling discovery. The man wasn't walking on the ground, but floating above it. Despite this supernatural revelation that would have sent most people running in the opposite direction, Sophia's great-uncle demonstrated remarkable courage and continued following the apparition. The pursuit lasted between 5 and 10 minutes, with the great-uncle tracking the ghostly presence deeper into the wooded area. Eventually, the figure stopped beneath a specific tree and, before the great-uncle's eyes, simply vanished into thin air. Though he searched the area thoroughly, examining the ground and surroundings, he found no footprints, no disturbances, no trace whatsoever of the mysterious visitor. Thoroughly unnerved by what he had witnessed, he abandoned the search and hurried back home, nearly running the entire way. While the floating man never reappeared to the family, their troubles in that house were far from over. They continued experiencing strange occurrences until they eventually moved away. Objects would inexplicably disappear, only to resurface in their original locations days later, as if they had never been moved. The family lived with these minor disturbances, accepting them as part of their daily lives in the haunted house. Decades later, in the 1980s, when Sophia's mother was a teenager, the family had another unsettling brush with the paranormal. Sophia's grandparents purchased a plot of land where they built a new home for themselves and for Sophia's grandfather's younger brother, creating a family compound of sorts. They hoped for a fresh start without supernatural interference, but their hopes were quickly dashed. Soon after settling into their newly constructed home, yet more unusual phenomena began plaguing the household. Doors would close by themselves without any draft or explanation. The strange occurrences they had experienced in their previous home followed them. Items would vanish mysteriously, only to reappear the next day in the exact same spot from where they had disappeared. These and similar disturbances became commonplace for the family. For reasons unknown, certain areas of the house seemed to attract more paranormal activity than others. Specifically, Sophia's mother's bedroom, the kitchen, and the second bathroom emerged as particular hotspots for these strange happenings. Though Sophia's mother frequently sensed an unseen presence watching her throughout the house, particularly in these active areas, she chose to ignore the eerie feeling, trying to maintain a normal teenage life despite the abnormal circumstances. Then came the day that would permanently change her perspective on the supernatural and would serve as a cautionary tale for future generations of the family. One fateful afternoon, a cousin arrived at the house with a Ouija board in hand. In typical teenage fashion, driven by curiosity and perhaps a dash of rebellion, Sophia's mother, her cousins, grandmother, and several friends decided to experiment with it, a decision they would soon regret deeply. Initially, when they gathered round the board and posed questions to whatever spirits might be present, nothing happened. To their disappointment, the planchette remained stubbornly still. Thinking a different combination of participants might yield better results, they rearranged the group, having different people place their hands on the planchette. When Sophia's mother and grandmother placed their fingertips on the indicator, the outcome was dramatically different. The reaction was immediate and frightening. The planchette began moving erratically across the board, responding to their questions with unexpected vigour, as if something had been waiting for precisely this combination of participants. As the session progressed and they continued asking general questions, Sophia's mother noticed something disturbing happening to her grandmother. Her posture, expressions, and mannerisms had altered completely, transforming her into someone unrecognisable. The way she sat and moved was entirely unlike her normal self. Then, in a strange voice, completely unlike her own, the grandmother began screaming, "I'm going to kill him," while laughing maniacally in a way that suggested complete detachment from reality. Alarmed by this dramatic personality shift, Sophia's mother asked who her grandmother, or whatever was speaking through her, intended to kill. The possessed woman fixed her gaze on one of the participants, a young man named Robert, and repeated his name with chilling certainty. Robert, perhaps as a defence mechanism or out of genuine scepticism, treated the situation lightly. He jokingly asked when and how his supposed death would occur, treating the whole episode as entertainment rather than a genuine warning. The entity, speaking through Sophia's grandmother, provided Robert with a specific date for his death and detailed exactly how it would happen. Despite the specificity and the disturbing transformation they were witnessing in the grandmother, Robert dismissed the warning as nonsense. a decision that would prove tragically misguided. Increasingly alarmed by what was happening, Sophia's mother attempted to end the session and commanded the spirit to leave her grandmother's body. But the entity refused to relinquish its hold. Even after physical contact with the Ouija board was broken, the grandmother continued her disturbing behaviour, screaming and laughing uncontrollably, as if still firmly in the grip of whatever had possessed her. Desperate and frightened, seeing no other way to break the spiritual connection, Sophia's mother resorted to physical intervention. She slapped her grandmother across the face. This shocking action seemed to accomplish what verbal commands could not, finally disrupting the entity's control. After regaining her composure, the grandmother began crying, clearly traumatised by the experience. When she had calmed sufficiently to speak about what had happened, she revealed a terrifying truth. Throughout the entire ordeal, she had been fully aware, able to see and hear everything transpiring around her, but had been unable to speak or move of her own volition. She described feeling something evil inside her, controlling her actions and words, while she remained trapped within her own body, a helpless witness to the entity's threats. Taking no chances after this frightening episode, the family immediately burned the Ouija board, destroying the perceived gateway that had allowed the malevolent entity access to their home. They also arranged for a priest to come to the house and perform a blessing, hoping to banish any lingering malevolent forces that might have remained after the board's destruction. The most chilling aspect of this story, however, came later. Robert, who had laughed off the spirit's warning and treated the whole episode as a joke, met a tragic end that confirmed the family's worst fears. He died exactly as predicted during the Ouija session, on the precise date mentioned and in the precise manner described by the entity speaking through Sophia's grandmother. This tragedy left such a profound and disturbing impression on Sophia's mother that she never touched a Ouija board again. Moreover, she strictly prohibited her children, Sophia and her brothers, from having any contact with such devices, fearing they might inadvertently open doors better left closed. According to Sophia, these accounts represented only a fraction of the paranormal experiences that had befallen her family over the years. She mentioned that she and other family members had experienced numerous other supernatural encounters, with many more stories yet to be told.
The following story took place in Georgia, USA in the early 1960s. Psychic hunches and premonitions ran in Mary Eastman's family, where her mother was able to foretell every major event that would affect her family. And it was so normal for the family to experience her abilities that when Mary was a child, she was surprised that other families did not have a mother with the same gifts. Mary's mother also had the ability to read tarot cards, but on one occasion, when she agreed to read the cards, she found that she had foreseen her own death, and within a year, her prediction had come to pass. 1 week after her funeral, a cousin of Mary's by the name of Carrie was sitting on the sofa watching television, when suddenly her aunt, Mary's mother, was standing in front of her with a smile on her face. Her auntie then lifted her arms in the air and said, "I'm not dead, see?" Carrie was thrown into a state of shock and quickly rang another cousin to seek verification that her Aunt Mary was really dead. Her cousin replied, "Well, she's definitely dead because we buried her last week." Carrie then sat back down on the sofa, believing she had dreamt everything, but a moment later her aunt reappeared and repeated the same message. Although Mary had grown up with psychic awareness, she herself never pursued it. Mary was later to marry a doctor and gave birth to 2 girls, Katie and Boots. But after 18 years, the marriage sadly ended, where she was left alone in the house with her 2 daughters, who were now teenagers. They later moved out of the house in late 1962 and moved into an 18-year-old, two-story, three-bedroom house in Atlanta. The moment they'd moved in, Mary felt there was something strange about the house when one night she was suddenly awoken by the sound of someone digging downstairs. She initially ignored the sounds, believing the neighbours were doing some digging for whatever reason, but when the noise continued night after night, Mary could no longer ignore matters. After closer listening, she realised that the digging appeared to be coming from beneath the stairs, directly under her bedroom, which was the basement. Mary was now curious as to what the sounds could be, and decided to go downstairs and look for herself. When she reached the location where she believed the sounds had emanated from, there was nothing to be seen either inside or outside of the house. Mary had expected to see scurrying rats or freshly turned up dirt, or the neighbours hard at work, but there was nothing to be seen. Mary went back to bed and the digging thankfully ceased. Unfortunately, the mysterious sounds that had originally awoken Mary had gone to another level. When exactly 2 a.m. the following morning, she and her daughters could hear the sound of someone trying to break into the house. When they inspected, there was nobody there. This pattern then repeated itself night after night, when Mary and her daughters were now losing sleep. Mary finally called the police, who quickly attended but found no evidence of a break-in. Mary decided to have heavy bolts installed to the rear and front of the house. The following day, Mary returned home after shopping, and after entering, found that the bolts had been torn away from the back door, from the inside. Mary would often have an afternoon nap, but her naps were now being disturbed by the sound of someone walking around the house, as if he or she knew the house well, and was followed by running water and a flushing toilet. How could they have entered when both doors were securely bolted? The disturbances continued as she was doing the laundry in the basement and could hear the sound of footsteps overhead, and then the sound of drawers being opened and closed and running water. Mary was determined to get her afternoon nap and decided to change the time to sleep. But whatever time she changed it to, the presence would adjust its disturbance to that new time. It was as if they could read her mind. On another occasion, her daughter Katie felt a pair of hands on her during the night when she knew she was by herself. On another terrifying occasion, Mary saw a pair of men's slippers appear in front of her with only the feet in them, but no other part of the body. But they slowly faded away. The family quickly grabbed some belongings and left the house. On another occasion, objects such as books would suddenly disappear and then reappear in other places. Someone was now playing cat and mouse with them, but who and why? At one time, they could all hear the sound of a typewriter in the basement, but they did not own a typewriter. One night Katie was awakened from a deep sleep and felt the presence of someone in her room, and then beside her bed. She could see a shadowy figure. The figure then vanished, but other strange events were now happening more often when someone kept pulling Mary's blankets off of her. It eventually became obvious to Mary and her daughters that there was more than one entity, where on one occasion they could hear the quick footsteps of a child running, accompanied by the heavier sound of an adult's footsteps. In January 1968, when they'd come to terms with the disturbances, Mary was awoken by the faint sound of music coming from the kitchen ventilator, and when she inspected, she could not find where the music was coming from. One night in bed, she could hear footsteps, and one set appeared to turn towards Katie's bedroom, while the other walked towards her bed, then abruptly stopped. She then felt an icy touch in her chest, where she screamed and jumped out of bed. She quickly checked her daughter's room and found Katie fast asleep. As she was standing at her daughter's bedroom door, she could smell a mixture of oil, gasoline and dirt coming from the bedroom, which smelled like an old gas station. Mary was now becoming concerned about both the seen and unseen forces at work in her house, and how they were able to manifest themselves this way. One night she awoke to the sound of a female voice in Katie's room, repeating the same phrase over and over again. golden sand. The voice sounded kind and gentle, and Katie was repeating it back in a childish voice and not her adult voice. Then she heard Katie clap her hands and say, "Now what can I do?" Mary quietly crept to her daughter's room and peeked through the door, expecting to see Katie sitting up in bed, but she was fast asleep. She woke her daughter, who looked confused, and told her to come into her bedroom, where she slept the rest of the night. The following morning, Mary asked Katie about the phrase golden sand, and did she remember saying it last night? She did not. However, it did sound familiar to her. A few days later, Katie spoke with Mary about an experiment she had undertaken the previous year during the Christmas holidays. She said that one evening she and two other girls decided to try out a homemade Ouija board and managed to communicate with a girl called Kathy, who'd claimed she had been murdered by her own brother, who lived with her mother and herself in a nearby house. She claimed they also had an insane stepfather, and it was his troublesome ghost, along with the mother and herself, that was causing all the problems in their house. The year was 1949, and the spot they buried her body was the area the digging sounds were coming from. Katie did not put much trust in the Ouija board and chose to ignore it. One night, Katie felt someone stroking her hair, and as she turned to look, could see a woman aged about 40. In order to find out what the woman wanted, Mary turned her own gift of mediumship and managed to communicate with her, where the woman repeated over and over again, "I need your help to cross the stream." Did this woman need help to break from the house and cross to the other side? But she did not know how to help her. 3 days later, as she was having her afternoon sleep, she heard someone come through the front door. She sat up in bed and screamed at it to go away. Then she heard an angry male voice say, "She can see me." But Mary saw nothing. A few hours later, she heard the familiar female voice whisper in her ear, "I need your help." Mary asked, "Where are you?" And she replied, "In the basement, in the dirt." Mary figured it was a male spirit causing all the trouble, while the female spirit was trying to protect everyone. Mary was now regularly feeling the woman's presence, but could not help her. Unfortunately, it seems that the friendly she got with the female spirit, the angrier the male spirit became. Mary had to find ways to get rid of the spirits. The voices and the footsteps started to get louder and more frequent, where the entities had now exhausted Mary, and after turning to her religion for strength, without any luck, voluntarily checked herself into a hospital to help her recover from a haunted house. On returning home, Mary sought help from people involved in psychic research in an effort to exorcise the presence in her home. The group carried out rituals to cast out the troublesome entities, but without much luck. She no longer heard the woman's voice, but the male became even more aggressive and demanding. He would scream at her to get up and do something, and her only salvation was to take sleeping tablets. One day the woman's voice managed to break through again and said she needed her to come to the basement, and the voice suddenly faded. Mary went down to the basement as she felt pity for the poor spirit. Short time later, everything in the house appeared to go quiet, and Mary wondered whether her presence in the basement had somehow allowed the woman to cross over. Hopefully, with the woman gone, the male spirit would no longer have strength to threaten. The house was now quiet as days grew into weeks and weeks into months, and the troublesome house remained calm. In 1964, Rebecca Keegan was a freelance artist, and her husband Parker Keegan was a truck driver who worked for a company in New York. Neither of them had any experience with haunted houses and would have called themselves skeptics when it came to the paranormal. The Keegans had one child and a second was on the way, so the Keegans were looking for a larger house to rent. At the time, Rebecca's cousin Jane and her husband Harry were living in a large house in upstate New York, and because Jane's husband was away a lot, she invited them to share the house, as it had two halves, so there would be plenty of room to accommodate the two families. Rebecca and Parker accepted her offer and decided to move into the large house. It was an old house, built in pre-Civil War days, and was attractive, at least from the outside. The ground floor had a large front room with two windows that faced the road and two other windows that faced the backyard. Next to the room was an old-fashioned dining room, and off of that room was a narrow kitchen and laundry. But the crowning glory was a large staircase and banister. The two apartments were separated by the staircase. Below the staircase was a cellar stairs that led to the basement. There were 3 cellars, with one under the old servant quarters, one underneath the front room, and one below the dining room. As Rebecca walked into the cellar below the dining room, she immediately had a sense of panic, but quickly brushed the fear away. They inspected the rest of the house, where the upstairs had 2 large bedrooms and 2 smaller ones, and there was also an attic which nobody had ever been in. When they met the owner, George Jones, he asked them a few questions, but one unusual question was whether they were religious people, which Rebecca thought strange. The Keegans officially moved into the house on a cold and snowy December in 1964, and after moving in all of their belongings, fell into bed that night totally exhausted. Rebecca was immediately awoken by strange noises, crackling sounds and noisy pipes that seemed to be coming from a cousin's side of the house, and put it down to the fact that it was an old house. However, the noises returned night after night. Now Rebecca was starting to feel concerned about her cousin having to put up with the constant noise, which would have kept her awake. When both their husbands were working nights, the women watched TV along with the constant banging of the pipes, and Rebecca could see that her cousin was becoming extremely jumpy with the constant noise and was becoming sullen. However, the noise went to a whole new level as Rebecca was lying in bed, and she could hear the sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, and she could tell that they were the steps of a heavy man. She knew it was not her husband because as he walked in the front door, she always heard a clicking sound of the door, and besides, he would not have made such a heavy sound coming up the stairs. Alarmed, she got out of bed and called out to her cousin, and then went to the top of the stairs, and was joined by a cousin coming from the other direction. From the top of the stairs, both women looked down and could see that the stairs were bending under the weight of each step. Someone or something was coming up the stairs, but they could not physically see them. Both women did not wait for the sound to reach the top of the stairs, and both ran screaming into their respective rooms. The following day, Jane left the house, leaving Rebecca by herself. In addition to the heavy footsteps, Rebecca was now hearing the sound of someone crying in the empty side of the house, and the fact that she was close to giving birth made her even more apprehensive. That night, the moment she got into bed, she heard the sound of the cupboard door banging, coming from the dining room. It sounded as if someone was opening and closing the cupboard door in rapid succession. Now that she was by herself, she was much too frightened to run down and investigate. Fortunately for Rebecca, her husband came home early that night and found her almost hysterical. Parker then went downstairs to investigate, but found nothing unusual, and got into bed thinking his wife had just had a bad dream. As soon as his head hit the pillow, he heard the sound of the cupboard door opening and closing downstairs, and he immediately jumped out of bed and ran downstairs. And as he got closer, the noise got louder. As he reached the dining room door, the noise was now extremely loud, and as he opened the door, he felt an immediate chill in the room. But then the noise abruptly ceased. Now confused, he looked around but could see nothing and returned to bed. Both he and Rebecca just looked at each other in silence, and no sooner had his head hit the pillow, the noise started up again. Parker again ran downstairs, and as soon as he opened the door, the noise immediately stopped. He then went back upstairs, totally confused, but was determined to sleep as he was exhausted. A few days later, Rebecca gave birth, and on returning to the house, found a new couple by the name of Winter had moved into the apartment. The Winters were much older and not too friendly and did not engage much. Rebecca found Mrs. Winter fairly tough and felt that not too much would frighten the woman, and her husband worked as a night watchman. However, it was not long before Mrs. Winter was banging on her door in fear. She said that it felt as if someone was trying to break in, and asked if he could sit with her for a while. Although Rebecca knew what was really happening, she did not tell her anything, for fear of frightening the lady even further. The Keegans decided to buy a German Shepherd both for the children and as a watchdog. Rebecca always felt she was never alone, and always felt as if someone was watching her night and day. She would occasionally hear strange noises coming from inside the walls that continued on and off. After a while, with so many strange things happening, Rebecca felt she was slowly becoming desensitized. On one occasion, she saw the door handle slowly turn by itself and just ignored it. There was no doubt that the house was haunted, but they did not realize the vindictive nature of the unseen inhabitants. One day she left the baby strapped in his seat while she attended to her daughter, who was climbing up the stairs, and she was worried she would fall down the stairs. As she reached her daughter, and at the precise moment, the strap broke on the baby pusher, and he fell out, fracturing his skull. The whole time they stayed in the house, someone was always having accidents or getting ill. Due to these illnesses, their medical expenses got worse, and Rebecca had to go out to work to help with the increasing debt, and Parker did extra shifts. This meant that Rebecca and the children would spend even more time alone in the house than previously. To add to their woes, they could not get a babysitter to stay long enough due to the continuing paranormal events. Rebecca then brought in her mother to babysit, but she too refused to stay in the house and offered to sit them at her house instead. Rebecca's teenage sister Mary then offered to babysit, but after a short while, her cheerful personality changed to depression and illness. On one occasion, when her sister was looking out the window, a face suddenly appeared that terrified her. To add to the drama, the dog would be constantly barking at something unseen. The final straw came when they were all sitting in the front room, and Mary had a cup in her hand, and as she was about to pour some tea, the cup suddenly flew out of her hand and smashed against Parker's feet. Mary immediately left the house, again leaving them without a babysitter. Rebecca's sister-in-law Susan offered to save the day. I was a total skeptic about the strange things happening and hoped to prove a point. She'd barely been in the house one day when she completely changed her tune. She said someone was watching her and complained of things flying off the shelf and cupboard doors opening and closing as if someone was rummaging for something. Susan would hear footsteps walking around upstairs, and the dog was no comfort, as it was more afraid than anybody. The following incident happened on Christmas 1966 as they were watching television, and out of the corner of her eye, Rebecca saw someone standing near the window at the back of the sofa where her sister-in-law was sitting. Fearing it was an actual person, Rebecca quietly said to Susan, "Get the rifle," as there was one in the corner of the room. Rebecca then turned her head to get a better look and could see an evil man's face scowling at them with hatred. As Susan pointed the gun at the window, the face vanished. They immediately ran outside, but there was nothing to be seen. Shortly after Christmas, Susan left, and Rebecca quit her job, and their financial problems got worse. Early in April, Rebecca and Parker were lying in bed when a dark form crossed from where their phone was, and it suddenly rang. The form then went over their bed and then down the stairs. The moment it reached the bottom of the stairs, the phone downstairs rang. After 2 years, the Keegans had had enough and moved out as the constant paranormal activity had left them spiritless and defeated.
An aggrieved spirit can be a powerful presence, and in this true account, the emotional energy of intense suffering during a lifetime caused all to run from the house it haunted. This is also the first authenticated multiple witness account of a haunting. It's unknown why the English lady Elizabeth Penniman decided to take her 2 daughters to France to live temporarily just at the start of the French Revolution. This places the events around the year 1789. The Penniman family were lucky enough to find a large furnished house for a low rent in the northern city of Lille. Here they settled with their entourage of servants and created a comfortable life. The first hint that there were any problems was when Lady Penniman went to the local bank to cash a payment from her husband. He was the British politician Sir James Penniman. When the bank manager paid Lady Penniman a large amount of silver, she asked if it could be delivered to her home, as she was planning to make some other visits. She described the house's whereabouts and then asked the porter if he would be able to find it. Strangely, he and everyone in the bank knew of the house. She then heard him mutter under his breath to the manager that it was the so-called haunted house. Lady Penniman dismissed the comment as ignorant superstition, but a few weeks later was forced to remember the man's words. It was then that the Pennimans' housekeeper, Mrs. Carter, who had come from England with the family, reported that 2 of the maids who had also accompanied them had given their notices to leave. The reason for their hasty exit was a nightly phenomenon in their bedroom of unexplained and terrifying noises. According to the young women, the noises could only have been caused by ghosts, reminding Penniman of the porter's comments about her house being haunted. The housemaids were unable to be persuaded otherwise and returned to England within the next 24 hours. The mysterious sounds had apparently occurred in the room formerly shared by the 2 servants, which was well away from Lady Penniman's part of the house. She and Mrs. Carter proceeded to make a thorough inspection of every nook and cranny of the large building. The supposedly haunted room was situated below a large granary on the floor above, apparently then an important feature in all French houses. Penniman and Carter inspected the long, spacious upper room, which appeared not to have been used for years, and found nothing out of the ordinary until they noticed something in the corner. This was a large circular iron cage, high enough to contain a grown man. On further questioning, Mrs. Carter claimed to have heard local stories about former occupants of the house and the possible use of the cage. Penniman dismissed her comments as idle gossip and became determined to put the matter to rest. The speculation was upsetting her children and disturbing the running of the household. Lady Penniman decided to sleep below the granary herself in order to dispel the rumours about the strange noises. The following night saw her bedding down in the servants' former room, aware of the empty cage in the room above her. The first few nights were uneventful, until early one morning Lady Penniman was awakened by a slow, heavy step pacing the granary floor overhead. The monotonous trudging meandered backwards and forwards for over an hour, then suddenly ceased. The next morning Penniman awoke with the opinion that there must be some way of getting into the granary from outside, known by another person. She resolved to discuss the matter with Mrs. Carter. At that time her son Charles was on leave from the Navy and staying with the family. He caused a stir in the formal household by dragging himself in late for breakfast, complaining that he had been unable to sleep all night. He claimed to have had people knocking on his door and peeping into his room every half hour, asking him if he had put out his candle. He blasted his mother for telling the servants to check on him. Lady Penniman was shocked, as she had done no such thing, and she was then concerned to hear from Mrs. Carter that the household had descended into chaos. Every single servant was now vowing to leave the house. Mrs. Carter suggested that her ladyship summons her friend, Mrs. Atkins, who was a pillar of practical kindness and seemed able to sort out any problem. At Penniman's written request, Mrs. Atkins duly arrived in Lille with her feisty fox terrier called Bob in tow. Mrs. Atkins was also a supernatural skeptic and secure in her own moral strength. She actually laughed at the family's paranormal take on the disturbances and, in full hearing of the servants, declared that she would in fact sleep inside the cage. She and Bob, an accomplished ratter, would lay any ghost to rest. A bed was then placed in the cage room, which was made comfortable for Mrs. Atkins. She examined the room thoroughly for any hidden passage, then bolted and locked her door before retiring for the night. However, her self-confidence was short-lived. She was suddenly awakened by a loud howl from Bob, who leapt onto the bed and crouched down beside her, shuddering. The bedroom door slowly opened, and a pale, thin, sickly-looking boy walked in, glanced at Mrs. Atkins, then advanced to the iron cage. There he stood for a few moments in a posture of extreme misery, before retracing his steps and leaving the room. More than ever convinced that the noises and visitations were part of someone's plan to drive the Pennymans out of the house, Mrs. Atkins grabbed her lamp and rushed after him. To her amazement, she found that the door was locked and bolted as she had left it. However, on opening it, she caught sight of the back of the youth as he descended the staircase. She followed him down the stairs, but when the apparition reached the ground floor, he appeared to sink into the floor and dissolved into nothingness. Mrs. Atkins promptly fainted. People emerged from rooms throughout the house as Bob's insistent barking raised the alarm. Mrs. Atkins finally came around and described what she had witnessed. She was adamant that her friends ought not to remain in such nerve-shattering surroundings. She could not deny the evidence of her own eyes. The very next day, Lady Penniman asked her landlord to release her from the tenancy, which he refused, also threatening reprisals if she spoke of the supernatural events and thus damaged his property values. Before the family left Lille, Lady Penniman found out the tragic story around the house and its bizarre haunting. A former occupant had imprisoned his nephew, a 16-year-old child, in the house. He had brought about the boy's demise with systematic starvation and cruelty. The boy was heir to massive wealth, and the uncle, who acted as his legal guardian, was wanting him done away with before he came of age. He found any excuse to punish the child and thought up the idea of the cage when the boy's resilience proved too strong. The boy was warned that the next time he offended his uncle, he would be imprisoned within the circular cage and there deprived of food and rest. As he drew nearer the age of inheritance, the boy's punishment became more brutal when he was subjected to 2 days of deprivation in the cage. Finally, the poor child's spirit and will to live were broken. However, his ghostly presence remained to haunt his treacherous uncle. It was rumoured that whenever the uncle entered the granary or cage room, he would see the figure of his unfortunate nephew collapsed on the floor and clutching the iron bars, with glazed and staring eyes and half-open mouth. In terror and remorse, the uncle sold the house for a song and left Lille to pursue a self-imposed exile. The house remained permanently haunted, which was the reason for its cheap rent. It is rumoured to be a house called the Place du Lion d'Or in Lille. This account has been popular over the centuries because it is one of few where there were multiple reliable witnesses to an apparition who were confirmed by all their families. The paranormal researcher Lord Halifax called the occurrence a highly compelling piece of evidence of the existence of ghosts and a reassuring hint at the prospect of continued existence on some other plane.